Welcome, everybody. My name is Katie Fizzell. I'm the Experiential Learning Strategist in Career Services within the EL Hub in Career Services. I welcome you today to this presentation called Beyond the Classroom, Building Experiential Learning into Your Curriculum. And I look forward to getting started and just chatting more about this topic with you and learning a little bit more about maybe your current practices, and I would invite you to participate in our breakout rooms. If you've got questions, you can pop them in the chat. I'm happy to keep an eye on that as we go. You can also try raising your hand, but I can't see everybody at once, so the chat might be better just if you do have a question. Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. I know that for me, as an individual from settler background, I'm very grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. And I think as we move into a new academic year and a new season, although it is still feeling very much like summer, but as we move into fall, it's important for us to consider how both our personal lives and professional roles at Queens are connected to these traditional territories, and what role we can play in reconciliation. And so I do plan on discussing a little bit of this later in the presentation. I think it's important to acknowledge right from the beginning that much of the educational theory that we'll be exploring today is founded in Western notions of teaching and learning, and that we need to consider how that influences our ideas of what experiential learning looks like in a Queen's course or a Queen's program. And learning more about Indigenous knowledge systems is something that I've been trying to work on over the last few years, knowing that it's especially relevant to conversations about how individuals learn from experience. So I look forward to sharing a little bit of that work with you today. It's certainly something that is ongoing for me and that I'm nowhere close to being done with. I don't think we ever will be, but so I guess I ask for you to consider that this is an ongoing process for me as well. And I look forward to just hearing your thoughts and having a conversation about that during those parts of the presentation. Okay, so the learning objectives for today are exploring our understanding of experiential learning theory, hoping that you'll understand the scope of EL at Queens. I probably will say EL just to shorten it because experiential learning is a bit of a mouthful at times. Identifying the core principles of experiential learning within a course design process, to learn a little bit more about the Experiential Learning Hub, our consultation process, the resources that we offer to support design and delivery of EL, and then we'll talk a little bit about guiding reflective practice. So I'd like to invite everybody. I don't have a handout or anything, but I thought maybe I could just invite you, if you have a piece of paper and pen in front of you, or you have a Word document or just in your head, to think of a few key words or phrases that you would associate with experiential learning. And then maybe jot down a few of the things that you would consider components of a curricular-based EL opportunity. And then a few ideas around what might some of the logistical planning considerations for designing curricular experiential learning be. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And then once you've had a chance to think about that, I would invite participants to share in the chat some of those key words or phrases for that first one, that definition of EL. Okay, thanks. So I see in the chat, learning by doing. Yes, I love this one. Practice as knowledge. Yes, great. Something that connects theory to practice, calls on students to reflect. Yes, hands-on learning. Okay, great. Student focused and fun. Yeah, that's great. I like the idea of fun. providing students opportunities to work on real world issues, labs, yes, active participation from all in the room. Okay, this is a great list. So now maybe I would invite, I think you can do this in the chat, or if you just want to unmute and share or raise a hand, what do you think might be some of the components of a curricular-based experiential learning opportunity? What are some of the things that we need to consider? And just get that pre-thinking. But yeah, you could pop that in the chat if you have an idea or two there. Accessibility, great. Course, yes, links to course objectives, safety. Okay, excellent. And what I'm seeing in this is that overlap between the planning, yes, projects with community. So the curricular-based piece and then the logistical planning. And in some ways we think of them separately, but there is overlap to be considered. Okay, so this is great. So this is just a way to kind of get you thinking, a place to take some notes as we go through, to think about your own understanding and definition of experiential learning, what is going to be most relevant to you if you were to take on the planning of a curricular-based opportunity, and then what are some of the learning or planning, logistical or planning logistical things that you need to think about as you design. Okay, so we're going to talk about EL theory now. So a little bit of background in terms of how Queen's defines experiential learning. In 2015, so it's been some time now, the Queen's EL working group was created and a report was produced. This was designed to develop a shared understanding about what EL looks like at Queen's. So at the time it was, they know what's happening all over, but didn't have a clear map of all the things that were going on. And so the goal was really to be able to recommend strategies that would facilitate development and growth of experiential learning. There was a real focus on self-sustaining curricular and co-curricular opportunities. So we know that developing and delivering EL is, it's resource intensive, it's staff intensive. Typically the groups of students that we can put into an EL course are usually smaller. So we're trying to find ways that we can do this in a sustainable manner. The goal was also, there were some goals around creating shared language, and then to make some recommendations to facilitate collaboration, sharing of resources, system-wide best practices to support instructors, admin, faculties. So that's where the Experiential Learning Hub came out of. And so that was developed, started the process in 2016, 2017. And I'll talk more about the services that we offer, but that's where I'm coming to you from, the EL Hub in the centralized career services office. And so this group also came up with their own definition of experiential learning, and you can see that up there on the slide. EL is first and foremost a teaching and learning strategy which facilitates a variety of learning outcomes for students. So it involves the locating of the experience within an intentional learning cycle that ensures that the experience leads to the achievement of learning objectives. And I know learning objectives were mentioned in the chat, which is great. So we're already kind of thinking along those lines about how we bring those together. And so across North America, Cole's Experiential Learning Cycle has kind of provided the foundation for how courses and programs have been designed. And his work came out in 1984, this cycle. And so he was building on a lot of, Western academics and educational philosophers who were talking a lot about the different ways that we can learn from doing or learning from practice. And kind of he packaged this into this cycle, which has been really easy, I guess, to think about in terms of course design. And so it starts with this concrete experience up at the top. And that is the doing or the having of the experience in an educational setting. That concrete experience is typically intentionally designed, to complement the learning objectives of the course. And then students move into a period of reflective observation. And so this is when they want to be reviewing, thinking about the experience, what happened, who was there, how many, like trying to think about different perspectives that maybe that were going on at the time. What kind of decisions did they make? So it's that recap of what happened. And then in the gray bottom piece, the abstract conceptualization, that's when we start to draw conclusions about what we learned. So now we're starting to make sense of what happened in relation to maybe theoretical concepts we were learning in a course. So that theory and practice piece. And then we're also thinking about why did we make those decisions? Why did someone else make a particular decision? What was maybe the impact of our presence in a particular scenario? How did that maybe influence what was going on? And so we're moving students into that more self-reflexive style of reflection and asking them now to kind of analyze and draw some conclusions. And so then the conclusions would be around, okay, what would I do next time? So if I were in that same scenario, would I do the same thing? Would I do something differently? And then ideally in a full cycle, the students would get to go back into a scenario and that active experimentation, they'd get to try things out again. And so not all courses can provide that opportunity, but this is kind of the ideal model. And so I noticed in the chat, there was that idea of producing knowledge through this way of learning. And I like to also just to think of this as like a co-production of knowledge with the students, with the individuals they're interacting with in the experience, and then the academic instructor, and kind of bringing all of these pieces together. And so the next slide I'll share with you is some work that was done by a professor named June Kaminsky she works currently at UBC Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health Studies. And so she's made this, she's done a lot of work on Indigenous educational models. And so she has created this diagram, which models Kolb's cycle, because it is the one that everyone is so familiar with. But she organizes it in, with a slightly different perspective of how this might apply for Indigenous students, or bring in more Indigenous ways of thinking about how we learn from experience. And so what I think is most important about June's work is that she acknowledges that learners are not always going to cognitively and effectively process the steps in a logical fashion. So sometimes some people are experiencing, and at the same time they're making snap decisions, and they're trying something different, and they're acting, and they maybe haven't gone through that reflective process, or maybe they haven't made meaning from something until they try again. And so I think it's important as instructors to acknowledge that we can have these cycles and we can have these nice diagrams, but that's not always how people learn, and not everybody is the same, and not all cultures and people of all different backgrounds are going to produce knowledge or make knowledge from, or create knowledge from experience in the same way. And so this is the work that I will continue to do through the EL Hub in terms of trying to create more resources to share with faculty around just different ways of conceptualizing experiential learning and thinking about what our goals are, and how we're serving the diverse needs of all of our students that might be in our courses and programs. And then this is another way of thinking. I really like this one. So this moves us away from the cycle and more into why experiential learning. And so this is work from Susan Well and Ian McGill. Back in 1990, they wrote a book, Making Sense of Experiential Learning. And so we know that the thinking about getting students out into the world and learning from experience, people have been thinking about this quite a bit for a long time. And they describe the global village of experiential learning, and they provide 4 models. And so this is kind of around the purpose, or what we're getting out of these experiences. And so for them, Village 1 is about assessing, accrediting learning from life and work experience. So I think it's really important with our students that we acknowledge that, yes, we are always learning, and that looks different for everybody. But we want to create some structure and some processes around this to help you get the most out of these experiences and really solidify that learning and be conscious about it. And so for them in that Village 1, by creating opportunities to learn from life and learn from work experiences, we're creating more avenues into higher ed, avenues into employment. We're bringing in skill development into the bigger picture, and how skills are connected to our, course learning objectives, and the theoretical learning and academic learning that's happening. In Village 2, EL as a basis for bringing about change in the structures, purposes of our curriculum in a post-secondary education. And so I think this is a really important one, and it goes along with Village 3 in terms of thinking about EL as an opportunity for conscious raising, community action, social change. At the university, the strategic directions are related, where there's a lot of work going on right now around community engagement and impact. And so many of our experiential learning courses have these elements in them. They're working with community partners. Community partners are bringing an issue to a group of students at Queen's, and they're working together to create solutions. And so that's how impact is being created. And so, EL kind of, it's a big umbrella term for all these different ways that we're out there engaging. And so I think we can think of it as a really useful learning model to create impact and to engage with community partners and to think about bringing about change in structures and systems. And then that last one, the personal growth and development in Village 4, I think that is really about the guided reflection that we can do with our students and making sure that they can really consciously consider and reflect and internalize and then articulate what it is that they learned from these experiences. It's easy to kind of go through the motions. It's harder to step back and then think about, okay, so what did I really draw from that and how am I going to use that in the future and what is that going to mean to me in the bigger picture of my academic next steps or my professional next steps or whatever it is that I'm going on, how it all kind of adds up. Okay, and then the last thing I just always like to mention, this is like a bit of a tricky topic when it comes to courses and types of EL. For us at the EL Hub, we are not to say what is and what isn't experiential learning, but we do often differentiate between active learning in a classroom, so doing lots of group work and engaging with others in the room and that type of thing, versus a really intentionally designed experience that is meant to create some type of replicable real world experience. So whether it's out in the real world or it's in the classroom, but there's that intentional design where there's an opportunity to really apply the theory in practice. And then the second line there, experience doesn't necessarily equal experiential learning, I think is also important. So we could send students out, to do an internship, but if we never create opportunities for them to set some goals and to think about that EL cycle and then to do the reflection and to do the debriefing after, then maybe we haven't created a real learning opportunity. We've just thrown them into an experience. So those are some of the distinctions that we try to make here in terms of helping when we do consultations with faculty around, course design. Okay. So what is the scope of, I guess maybe I'll just pause there. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we move on? And while I'm not 100% sure about the slides, I think that'll be for Carolyn to answer. I'm happy to share them.
If Katie's happy to share them, the CTL can facilitate that. We'll work with Katie and then we'll send them out to those that were registered and attended the session.
Okay. Thanks.
Jermaine, I saw your hand go up really quickly.
Thank you.
And I put it back down because I imagine that you'll get into this, but I really enjoy the framing so far because I'm already seeing where some of the EDI components weave in when we talk about the experiential components of pedagogy and how that's been absent and what kind of including it means. I'm also fresh off a reread of Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress, so some of this is really kind of pinging in my brain, but I'm really enjoying the presentation so far.
Well, thank you. And I do have a couple slides around some of the I-EDIAA considerations that we want to start to bring to the forefront. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay. Okay, great. So we'll talk a little bit about, was there someone else? Sorry, I hear a, okay. So in terms of just the scope of curricular EL at Queen's, we don't have, I would say that we don't have set definitions. We've tried, we work towards some common language, and that's what this slide shares here. So on the curricular side of things, we have our long-term internships. And so like at Queen's, that is the QUIP program, the Queen's Undergraduate Internship Program. And we, Faculty of Arts and Science, Engineering, Health Sciences, School of Computing, all participate in that. And that's where students are doing the 12 to 16-month internship, typically between third and fourth year. And those are paid 4-credit experiences with a professional degree designation that students graduate with. Then we have course-specific work integrated internships. So these are for credit. They are seeing students go out into professional work environments. They're typically part-time, typically one term. They might be paid or unpaid. Some examples are the Devs Work Study Program. Film has an internship. History has one like this now, political studies. So these are starting to grow. And then we have practicums. And so these are the curricular mandatory professional practice related to degree or certification. So we've got nursing, OT-PT, education, those types of programs. And so there are unique logistical planning pieces around that due to the fact that these are mandatory components for accreditation. Then we have courses that contain EL projects. And so this is actually probably the best way to scale EL. And this is typically then with students working in groups. There might be an employer partner or a community partner. The community partner or employer are bringing an issue, a problem, an idea to the class, and then the students are working together on some kind of project, would probably have some kind of deliverable at the end. Ideally useful to the organization that they'll decide then how they would implement that. And so we see a lot of this in engineering in the first year. We've had some other courses. LCU had a course like this, and there's the ASPX courses that are interfaculty between engineering and arts and science. And students have been working on projects such as the Standing Whale project. So we're seeing growth in that area as well. On the co-curricular side, one of the things that we have been doing is adding an experiential learning kind of wraparound. We call it the EL wraparound to on-campus roles. So these are paid or unpaid positions, peer health programs, volunteers, that type of thing, where students are working with units on campus, and then we're training the units and providing them with resources to do some goal setting with students and then to do some reflection. So it's not as robust as you would do in a course, but it is creating some more intentional learning for the students in those particular roles. So that's the bigger picture there at Queen's. And now we'll move on to curriculum design. And so I'm going to share a few slides with you, and then we're going to do some breakout rooms in another few minutes to give you a chance to kind of discuss and debrief some of the stuff that I've been chatting about. So what's involved in EL curriculum design? So first off, there's setting learning outcomes and learning outcomes for programs, learning outcomes for courses, thinking about where the experience comes in terms of your learning objectives. And so being really intentional with the design of what that experience is going to be. It doesn't mean that it's only one type of experience, but it's intentional in the sense that you are setting parameters. So if, let's say in a course where students are going to go and find their own, like let's say 80-hour placement, you give them really clear parameters around the types of organizations, the type of experiences that you believe would be best suited, and how they connect back to the particular learning outcomes for the course that you want to have, best, the experiences that are going to bring those learning outcomes best to light through the experience, and give the most opportunity for students to think about that relationship between theoretical learning and practical learning. There are the I-EDIAA considerations, which I have another slide and I'll go over those in more detail. There's how are you going to prepare students for the experience? So what is going to be in your curriculum that is going to be preparatory, and what is related to the academic learning, and then what's just related to the logistical pieces that they need to know, like health and safety, risk management, those types of things before they actually go out. And this would be primarily for experiences that take place off campus. And then because I'm in career services, we're always emphasizing where you can you bring in some awareness around the skill development piece. So, we actually do workshops a lot of the time with instructors that have the courses and they're doing all the prep, but then we come in and we just do a workshop on how to integrate into a new workplace, or let's help you with some skills assessment and what skills are you going to be using out in the placements. So these are the types of things that you can kind of build in and layer into the curriculum as well. And then there's guided reflection and critical analysis. So like we said, that's kind of the most important piece in terms of really adding the pedagogy of EL to the experience. Or to the course, and then the debriefing at the end. And then of course there's assessment and evaluation. So what does that look like? Does there need to be more flexibility? Is there more choice? How do you assess both learning that took place in a practical setting and the theoretical learning for the course? So there's a lot of thinking to be done around that piece. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's very challenging to grade personal reflections from students. So there is some thinking around how do we create open and safe, comfortable environments for students to share those personal reflections, especially when they've been out in an experience where we haven't been there with them. We don't know exactly what was going on. And then how do we assess their learning in that type of situation? Okay. Then on the logistical side of things, and this is the fun part that most instructors, when we start to talk, it can be a little bit overwhelming because it's not part of a normal course design process. But there's the thinking around the strategic alignment with your broader program. There's thinking around like how many EL courses can a student do in a particular program. Then there's the I-EDIAA considerations. There's barriers that we know of to experiential learning for equity, deserving and underrepresented students. There's accessibility and accommodations, and those are going to look different, especially when students are going out to some type of workplace or a community partner. There's thinking about funding opportunities. So are there grants out there that you can access? Are there ways to compensate students that may not have as much access to the funds that might be required to participate? Sometimes work permits for students, for international students, can be a situation that you have to consider. And then there's the risk assessment. So we need to be aware of employment standards. Where are our students going? What category do they fall under? It can change if they're paid versus not paid. And then there are broader affiliation agreements that the university has with certain partner organizations. This is especially prevalent in healthcare. So they might be 5-year agreements. And so it's trying to figure out, do we already have an agreement? What is the host organization going to require from us? For one-offs, where students are all going to different placements, we have EL agreements that the partner needs to review and sign, and that needs to go through contract review process here at Queen's. That is also some of the work that the EL Hub has been doing, working with our risk management partners across campus. So legal counsel, health and safety, risk and insurance, research services, to help streamline these processes. We have a pretty good process in place now, but it still takes time. And so it can take up to a full semester in advance of coordinating all of those pieces. And then there's the health and safety of your students while they're away, making sure that they're aware both of physical health and safety, as well as things like harassment and discrimination, and helping them navigate that out in a workplace or with a community partner. And then we have our off-campus activity safety policy. So that's a whole online system that students need to be registered in if they are going off campus for some type of placement. And then that all kind of connects to the host organization. So there's the outreach that you need to do. There's the partnership. We don't have, people often ask, do we have a database here at Queen's where every single partner that every program is working with is, entered into there? And no, we don't have something like that, and we probably never will. We know from other universities that those are very hard to maintain. But so there is some relationship building to be done across programs and across faculties in terms of sharing who are you working with, because we want to be mindful that we're not doing outreach to a host organization that already has 4 courses that they work with or something like that. And so that's typically handled more within the faculties than at the EL Hub full central level. Okay. So I would encourage you now, we've kind of done the logistical and the curriculum design, just to look at those little mind maps or notes that you maybe made, and whether things that I got all of those, or whoa, I didn't think about those. So just some thinking around, where were you at when you started the presentation in terms of all the pieces that you might have thought go into bringing in EL opportunity into a course or program. Okay, and now this is the last slide before we do the breakout rooms. So this is just kind of an overall summary of just, if we think about core principles, it is that intentional design. It's meeting existing host organization needs. So when we partner with a host organization, whether it's an employer or a community partner, a not-for-profit, are we aware of their needs? Are we aware of the resources that a host organization needs to provide in order to host our students and supervise our students or assess our students? Right? Because some courses will ask that the supervisor at the placement do an assessment. Some courses won't require that. Maybe it's just a sign off on the hours. So thinking about what is their capacity to host a student. What are their goals, values? How do those align with your course? The alignment between the learning outcomes and professional skill development. And again, that's an area that Career Services is always happy to support with. Creating opportunity for students to set their own learning goals for these experiences. So yes, you have course learning objectives, but it's always helpful for students to really think about what that's going to mean to them. Seeing the instructor as a facilitator of learning, a guiding force for reflection, and a person to debrief with, to check in with, and that goes to that guided reflection, and then the assessment and feedback. So how do you assess learning in these scenarios, and how do you provide feedback to students when maybe they're gone for 3 or 4 weeks of your course? How do you structure that in order to create those opportunities? Okay, so that's a lot of me talking. We're going to go into some breakout rooms, and what I would love for you to do is just have a look at this slide right now. And just have a chat about everything we've been talking about, and kind of in 3 buckets I have here. If you want to chat about what is the value of an EL experience to student learning and skill development. So why would we take on all the work associated with doing designing and implementing EL? What will be some of the challenges of designing, planning, facilitating experiential learning? And then I just want you to start to brainstorm together what are some of the EDIAA considerations for an experiential learning opportunity. And I will share more after you come back on that particular topic, but I think it's good for you to start thinking about what some of those might be. Okay, yes, Lynn?
Yeah, sorry, maybe everyone knows this, but what does I-EDIAA stand for?
Okay, so this is Queen's new it used to be EDIAA, I'm sorry. So it's Indigenous, Equity, Deserving, Equity, Diversity, Inclusivity, Accessibility, and Anti-Racism. And I might have got the 2 A's flipped, but those are the 6 terms that we're bringing together. And my understanding is that Queen's brought the Indigenous to the front of the acronym because it was kind of getting melded in, and they wanted to bring that work of decolonization and indigenizing the university to the forefront of this whole scope of work related to equity, diversity, accessibility, inclusivity, anti-racism, and yeah. So thank you for the
awesome.
question.
Thank you.
I apologize for not defining that first, if that was confusing to anybody. So what I'm asking, is to just talk about what do you think are some of the things we need to consider along those lines? How do we make these opportunities equitable? How do we account for diversity in our students and our employers? How do we make them, and how do we think about, equity deserving students, underrepresented students, their identities? How does that all play into our thinking through the design of an experience? Okay, is that good, Carolyn? If that all sounds like it's making sense, we can put everybody into groups of 3, and then we will rejoin in let's say 7 minutes to chat about that.
All right, I'm going to send everyone an invitation for a breakout room.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. My apologies. I should have put those 3 topics in the chat before you all went into your breakout rooms. I know one of the groups came back and said they were a little confused. So it was meant to just be an opportunity to kind of chat through just some reflections on what we had talked about, and with those kind of 3 guiding topics. So I'm just wondering, now that we're back as a group, if anybody would like to share any highlights from their conversation, anything that kind of came to light. So you can unmute or raise a hand.
I can say something. Our group was specifically discussing how you suss out the companies that are going to be providing these educational learning experience. And by suss out, I mean, we were discussing the fact that places could verbally tell you that they're very inclusive and accepting and giving equal opportunities to all people. And it's all great to say these things verbally out loud, but it's like another thing to put them into practice. And it was just like, a lot of our conversation came back around to, as an instructor, how difficult it would be to put all this work in to develop these relationships with these companies, and potentially that part being a little bit out of your control in practice. And just like, I guess what our overall discussion was making sure that there's lots of point of contact with the student and getting feedback on how things are going and different check-in times so that students have the opportunity to advise if things are not going the way that they hoped, or if like a female is not getting the same kind of opportunities as other male partners, or I don't know what might come up, but different things like that. That was kind of what some of our barriers that we discussed.
Yeah, that is so important. And I think you're right that we can do all the due diligence that we can think of. And those are some of the things that the EL Hub can support with in terms of some checklists around doing that outreach. But you're right, we can't fully control what's happening in a particular workplace or in a particular work or environment. So those touch points with students in terms of when do they check in, how do they get in touch with you, are incredibly important. And the more thinking through how that's embedded into the course structure, the better, right? So that they know how to get in touch, they know when to get in touch, they know what types of things they should be talking to you about. So that's all really, really important. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Debbie? Your hand up.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came up just near the end of our group's discussion was the idea that if you go out into the community for practicums or for internships, the learning, the real learning might not actually be related to any of the tasks that are necessarily connected to the program. The real learning might actually be in trying to understand the relationships, the interaction with the community itself. That might be the core of the learning. And so, which makes me wonder then, if the course is stipulating the learning outcomes, then this can be a complicated moment, because the students' reflections and maybe the work that they do for their course or their university component might actually not be specifically, I don't know how to say this, but in line with those learning outcomes, because maybe it morphed somehow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is all good.
Yes.
And important. And maybe for that particular student, the task wasn't the learning outcome they needed. Maybe they had that. Maybe that was already in their pocket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting and so insightful. And I think, again, that speaks to when we're designing experiential learning, where can we create room and flexibility within some of our assessments for students to share that learning and to be able to express that and articulate it. And I would suggest that in the learning outcomes for a course, there's a balance between the theoretical or the applying or learning the theory to practice piece, and then that skill development piece. And can we bring connections between that so that there is, tied into your learning objectives, that more personal growth or skill development component somewhere in there? What are they learning about that industry or that workplace and about themselves? So whether it's in your learning objectives or whether it's through different assessment practices and different methods for guiding reflection, creating that wide open space for all the type of learning that could take place, I think, is really important. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to, just keeping an eye on the clock, we'll move on, but thank you to everyone for participating in those breakout rooms and sharing thoughts with each other. So this is the slide sharing these I-EDIAA considerations for experiential learning. And so this diagram that you see on the side there is taken from some work that the University of Toronto has just completed, and they've done a really amazing, it's in a website, it was a chapter in a book called Advancing Equitable and Inclusive Experiential Learning Opportunities, a 5-stage framework. We're working right now to develop kind of this is a really big resource that they've created, a slightly condensed version that will go into our experiential learning faculty toolkit. But I just wanted to bring these to light, that some of the considerations here are that we know that there are structural and systemic barriers that are resulting in lower participation rates for underrepresented students in experiential learning opportunities, especially things like internships and co-ops. We know that students may not identify with the values or the missions of partner organizations, especially when we are developing, like as instructors or programs are developing those partners. So we may not always be thinking about broadening the scope and thinking more about who do our students want to engage with. We know that costs of participation can be a barrier. So things just like PP, like personal protective equipment, CPICs, like vulnerable screening checks that require or that have a cost associated with the medical tests. If there's travel, sometimes for field work, there's equipment, gear, and there's an unfamiliarity potentially with some of the things that are needed. And then there's geographic barriers, so just the distance that individuals need to travel, access to transportation. So that kind of ties back to, can we find sources of funding? Can we find ways to offset some of these costs? And there's not a lot out there, I can tell you that. So we have to be kind of always thinking about what can we access and making the most of what we can find. Access to personal, social, professional networks. This is especially relevant when we are asking students to find their own placements. And I know there are a number of courses where, yeah, we'd love to support an 80-hour opportunity for you. We'll support you in finding it, but we're not actually going to go out and do the host organization outreach. So how do individuals have different access to those networks that they might require? Oh, thank you, Carolyn, for putting that link in there. Yeah, and I will share that as well at the end. Sorry, and then access to prerequisites. So just know, the research shows that if we have prerequisites related to GPA, that we can screen out equity deserving and underrepresented students. Just simply right there, that they just don't have the grade average or the prereq to get into the course. And as was mentioned, inclusion and belonging processes at host organizations. How do we discover that? How do we communicate to host organizations what we believe to be best practice? So we do have resources here at Career Services for employers, and then faculty that are designing courses can think about how they integrate those into materials like, a supervisor manual or a host organization manual. And then student awareness of rights and their mechanisms for reporting. And so this is another thing that has come to light in the last few years, that students are not aware of all of their rights, and they don't really know how to report, or they don't know what the university is going to do if they report something to their instructor. They don't know if their credits are going to be in jeopardy if they don't finish the placement, and so they tend to not report. A big study was just done by a Canadian organization called Possibility Seeds on sexual harassment in experiential learning. Their findings were that the reporting of students through their survey results were quite high. And there is an acknowledgement that we don't have policies specific to sexual harassment in an experiential learning setting. We have broader university policies. So I'm working with the EL risk management group to look at, like, how do we apply those policies to our EL students, and how can we raise student awareness? How can we raise employer awareness? And how can we make sure that our students are confident to report or disclose, and they feel confident in what we're going to do with that information, and how they're going to be accommodated, so that they're not losing credits and they're not losing that path to graduation that might be dependent on a particular course or experience. Okay, so that's just a lot to think about, and the resource that I'll share with you in a bit. We have the types of these considerations kind of woven into your planning process, and more things to kind of think about in terms of, I guess, mitigating or addressing some of those barriers. And so that brings me to the EL Hub consultation process. So we here, you can book a consultation, and we will talk about the planning, the logistics. We've got charts and charts with questions for you to answer, to help you think through all of the pieces. We'll help connect you with other instructors that we know are working in similar areas or with similar types of partners, so that you can start to do some of that, like who else is working with who, and where might I fit in, where can I start for outreach. We have a lot of employer partners that we're connected to through our employment services, so there's another starting place. And so when we do meet, I will put a link in the chat in a minute, but we have the EL faculty toolkit. So it's a guide that you can go through. It's in a PDF or Word version. And so we have a logistical planning chart, a curriculum design chart. We have a sample learning plan for students that you could, use and adapt as an assignment. We've got some rubrics for grading and assessing reflection, and we've got some strategies for guiding reflection. We have a student supervisor learning contract, those types of templates, performance evaluation templates, and some other lists. And like I said, we're always working with our risk management team, and we are always kind of trying to share as much information as we can through our faculty contacts. Oh, thank you, Carolyn, for putting that up as well. Okay, so our last 5 minutes are just to talk a little bit about strategies for guiding reflection. And so while I'm chatting, if you want to put in the chat what types of strategies you've used in the past to guide student reflection on experience, if that's something that you've done, or you're welcome to share personal strategies for how you reflect on practice or experience. And then I would just ask, because we only have 5 minutes, I usually would ask the group to think a little bit about how you might differentiate between surface level reflection and more critical or self-reflexive forms of reflection and analysis. So I wonder if maybe I'll just put that question out to the group if anyone wants to unmute and share how they might differentiate between those two before we move on. So surface level versus critical reflection.
I can say something
Yeah.
because I was just in the middle of typing a million words. But I think surface doesn't engage you with the why of your thinking by the end of the process. Because it's easy to tell people, let's say, quote unquote, what to think, but getting into those deeper questions of, why did you find this easy or difficult? You observe these things. Why do you think they were the way they are? One thing that I sometimes find students, they get a little bit like, oh, but my placement was really straightforward, like nothing happened. And I'm like, well, no, things happen. But there are a lot of different ways to kind of support them in starting to think about the things that happen. One way that I sometimes like to segment it, it's, before the experiential learning, what are your expectations? What are you hoping to do? What do you think you'll be contributing? During it, observing what's happening, and then using the after as a way to combine those prior expectations with what happened. And now at the end of it, did you meet your expectations? Did you hope something else had happened? Why did you want something else to have happened? How does that sometimes relate to the overarching theme of the course? There was this one, and I'll say this and then I'll shut up, but there was this one course that I supported as a TA many years ago, Beauties, Bodies, and Cultures. And the final assignment was an option between an essay and a body modification project, which, you can do something as simple as painting your nails and then going through your life with painted nails for 2 weeks. And again, the observations, and then combining the theory of the weeks. What did you expect would happen? What did you suspect would happen in different environments that you operated there? If you're an athlete, using this as an example, what do you expect would have shifted? So I think, it's really deeper thinking is supporting them in getting to those why questions and extrapolating those why for themselves and why for the people around them.
Yes, thank you. I love that you ended with the why for people around them. So building in that next level of this is the experience and how you experienced it and how might it have impacted those around you, because that's all part of that critical analysis of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So thank you. I mean, that's an amazing kind of recap of how I would differentiate between those two as well. And I think a lot of the time when we tell students they need to reflect for an assignment, that surface level reflection ends up being like, okay, this is what I did. This is where I went. This is who I worked with. And it's just that, or it's just an observation or two, and it isn't that level of analysis. Yes. So thank you so much for that. So, okay, sorry. So high quality reflection, I think we just want to think about, are there opportunities to do this, the autonomy to do it individually, to do it the way that you want to do it, in a method that works for you. But is there also opportunity for collaboration to check in with not just your instructor, but your peers to share those experiences? Are there opportunities for students to reflect with their supervisors or coworkers in a particular placement because they've been there, they're experiencing the same thing? How are you giving feedback, and how are you getting students to discuss and debrief challenges? And so high quality reflection is continuous, it's ongoing. There's those connections between personal experience and the broader community. But there is that, you know, that we play a role in guiding. So like the questions that you were sharing, Jermaine, those are the types of questions we can use to guide reflection. Give those prompts, create a journal with some prompts or an activity with some prompts, and then see where students take that, and then give them the space to take that where they want to. If you're setting goals, can we revisit those goals? Can we update those goals? And then that critical reflection is, I think this is then bridging into, you know, can we question our personal assumptions and biases before, during, after? Can we start to explore how theoretical knowledge, maybe after we do the experience, we find some gaps in that theoretical knowledge, and that consideration of multiple perspectives. So this is kind of the fun stuff. This is some other work that I'm doing. I've been looking a lot and working closely with the CTL on the pedagogy of peace and how we might, which is, I have a slide here just to quickly share that, the work of Lindsay Brandt and Lindsay Morcom. And this is available on the CTL's website, and I'm starting to explore how we might be able to create a resource for instructors that would show how they might be able to bring this framework into their reflective practice in an EL course and in an EL course design. So that's some resources that are forthcoming. So I would encourage anybody, if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them, to meet with you, to talk with you about any of the topics that we've discussed today. So thank you so much for joining me. It's 2:30 on the dot, so of course, if you need to go, please do, but I'm happy to stick around if you have any other questions to wrap up.